We gonna talk about plants. Botany. Let's just dive right in. I want to see how quickly we can get this done. Um, Plants, eukaryotic, autotroph, cell walls out of cellulose, alternate between haploid, diploid, embryophytes. They have a protected embryo and a seed. This is what photosynthetic autotrophs means. Alternating in generations means sometimes the organism will be haploid, sometimes it will be diploid. Ferns are a very good example of that. In the bottom left, the fiddlehead is the 2N organism. The rhizoid, which is also the mature form, is the 1N, and they'll alternate between what they show up, but there's usually a dominant one. Um, So there's four groups of land plants: bryophytes, ferns, gymnosperms, angiosperms. All of these were adaptations to move on land. You should be able to identify these at this point. I'm not going to talk about them. Bryophytes, non-vascular land plants. Mosses is pretty much the one you need to know. Um, Typically ground hugging because they're non-vascular. They need to get that water. Next, and like an evolution from biophytes, is sperms. They now become 2N normally. They can be 1N. And they do have vascular, so they can grow taller, but they live in damp areas because the sperm need to swim to reach the eggs. Gymnosperms, they have enclosed, or they're not enclosed, so the seeds are still exposed, like on a cone. 2N, again, the tree is the dominant form, um, and seeds are exposed. Angiosperms, the seeds are usually enclosed in a fruit or a nut. 2N is the dominant generation, most abundant plant species. The structure and function we need to know: root system, shoot system. There are two types of plant forms that we see: eudicot, and then your monocot. We also call it dicot and monocot. Dicot is just like multiple nodes and buds. Monocot is one stem with the leaves branching off the main stem. Roots is an amazing adaptation. We see all types of weird root adaptations. Storage roots, like on tomatoes and turnips. Prop roots to hold a tree up. Buttress roots, we'll see. I saw a ton of those in Puerto Rico. They allow plants to get water in like sandy soil. Stems, the stem is usually support, but we see all of the adaptations: bulbs, rhizomes, tubers. All of these are stem adaptations. I know I said before the potatoes were a root adaptation, it's actually a stem adaptation. Then the third one is the leaves. We see that there's simple leaf, compound leaf, and doubly compound leaf. Just has to do with like the number of leaves on a stem. The fewer, the more simple it is. Adaptations, they might have spines or tendrils, or they'll be storage leaves, so they'll get really fat, similar to like an aloe plant. Reproductive leaves, things like that, helps them adapt to reproduction and photosynthesis mostly. Um, Three types of tissue: dermal, ground, and vascular. Dermal is the very outer layer. Ground is the one layer in. That's mostly like storage and like not fat, but like basically fat. And then vascular is your xylem and phloem. This is where we see dermal, ground, and vascular. Dermal is red, ground is green, vascular is purple. In the dermal tissue, which we see in like leaves and the outer laying of all of the plants, we see stomata, holes in the dermis, trichomes, leaf hairs, and root hairs. In the ground tissue, we see three kind of adaptations. You don't need to memorize those. Transport xylem and phloem, transporting fluids and things like that. Moving on to the next set of slides. Part two. So we've talked about like the structure of the plants. Now we want to talk about growth and development. Um, in your apical meristem, this is primary growth and growth of length. Lateral meristems allows for growth in girth. The meristem are just these tissues that aren't a specific thing. They're like stem cells for plants. In plants, we see that there are reproductive parts. The receptacle and the ovary holds the egg. The stigma is the female part. The anther or the stamen, and so that's the anther and the filament. Those are your male reproductive part with the pollen. Reproduction in angiosperms. The egg and the sperm are 2N. They fertilize to make an egg. The egg is dropped off somewhere, and it eventually becomes 2N. Double fertilization can happen, and you can basically get a 3N organism, or you get what's called a polar body, similar to, if you remember from meiosis, right? You can get polar bodies and they'll just die. Coevolution of pollinators and flowers. You should be able to explain this. If you can't, ask me. Structure of the seed. Basically, it is a dormant embryo surrounded by a hard shell, and water and heat and warmth cause that protective shell to go away, and it will sprout. There's two types of germination, either water or rupturing of the seed. Those will both start germination from happening. There's tons of adaptations for seed dispersal. They look like this. Oh, I'm gonna regret that. 3. I know this is super fast. If you have more questions, please ask me. Nutrients, they absorb them through the roots. They absorb them from the air. Transpiration, you should know this term at this point. We get water from the roots into the xylem and then into the capillaries and all the way to where they need to go. Transpirational pull is due to the evaporation of water from the leaves, and we know that moving from a concentration from high to low, so water concentration is high at the base, low at the leaves, and so it's going to move upwards. Minerals also move in. They're going to need active transport to be moved because they're a little bit bigger a lot of the time. You use a hydrogen ion concentration gradient to do this. So think to any sort of transport with this happens in cellular respiration. Macronutrients are required: carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, and it's very evident to see if a plant is lacking this. There's a ton of other nutrients that plants need as well, called micronutrients. We see sometimes that plants will rely on other organisms for their needs. We call it mutualistic. Think back to animal behavior. This is roots and a fungus that helps it get its nutrients. Not only can roots draw it in, but gas exchange occurs, CO2, O2, and water in the stomata. Equation for photosynthesis. I assume that we know photosynthesis at this point. Water's in the root. It's going to move upwards through the xylem using osmosis, and basically it causes the cells to become really rigid and the water to move upwards. For water and all the other fluids to move upwards, it requires the TACT theory, or tension, adhesion, cohesion, transpiration. Tension, right? We should know this. If you need refreshers on water molecule and what they do, maybe look back if you need to. We've talked about adhesion and cohesion and how they attract to the walls of the xylem and to themselves, so they end up moving up due to the transpirational pull. Generation of transpirational pull. As water evaporates, it leaves space for water to move in the correct concentration gradient way. Hydrogen bonds, we know that they're very special. Water potential quantifies the tendency of free water to move from one area to another. Water potential, right, means that there's a high water potential if there is high solute, low water, right? Osmosis, think hypertonic, hypotonic, isotonic stuff. Just think about the way that water would move in those situations, right? Just like this. Water pressure is directly related to tonicity. Higher water pressure means that my tonicity is like how tonic or like how rigid my walls are. And so the more water shoved into a cell, the more like rigid the cell walls are going to be. Right? It looks like this. We call a very fat cell turgid, a normal cell flaccid, and plasmolyzed is a totally shrunken cell. Wilting, right? Loss of water. Stomata open and close to control transpiration rate. Think about like time of day and when that would happen. The potassium ion is what's necessary to open and close stomata, so without potassium, plants will die. Plants also need to moderate how much water they lose, and so depending on the day, the temperature, time of year, that's gonna dictate that. Natural selection in arid environments, we see that they don't really have leaves. They adapt to have different leaves, right? And so that allows them to decrease the loss of water. These are some things that allow them to adapt to those arid environments. Pause at these if you really need to look at them. More adaptations to water environments. This is a lot of common sense, right? If I'm a plant, what things do I need to do to be able to live in really watery environments, really dry environments, my temperate environment? These are all nutritional adaptations in plants. Epiphytes grow on another plant. Parasitic, basically like mistletoe is a parasite. Carnivorous plants will eat like insects and things like that. Halophytes live in water. Some organisms adapt to be in saline environments. And we're going to pause there. Those are 3 sets of slides for plants. Hopefully it's a lot of